Hi, everyone. This is Katie at CLARA. I lead our marketing here, and today I'm very excited to introduce our speakers for this webinar. It's the first in our Hidden Potential series, and we'll be talking about some of the research that we did around three very important constructs. So today we have our CEO at CLARA, Natasha, and then we also have Kylie King, who's our academic researcher, and she's currently at SUNY Plattsburgh. So today we'll be covering a few different things. First, we'll be talking about some of the trends and challenges in traditional hiring processes. We'll do a little introduction to the research that CLARA recently did. We'll talk about how to uncover hidden potential in candidates. And we'll give some real world applications for what this actually looks like when you are in the hiring process. So today, if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A box. We will also provide a recording of this after the webinar within 24 hours. So thanks, everyone, and let's jump in.
Hi, Katie.
So today, HR and TA teams across the globe face a multitude of challenges every day. We hear this all the time from our prospects and customers. So these are some of the most common challenges that we have heard. And we'll actually focus on how you can start to address many of these challenges today. And I'm going to now hand over to Natasha, who will talk a little bit more about this.
Hi, and thank you, Katie. Excited to be here with you all today and excited to be chatting with my friend, Dr. Kylie King, who did the research on this for us. So just a little bit of history on how we landed on this and why it became important for us to be thinking about these constructs, really when it comes to hiring and bringing in talent for our teams. So the co-founders of CLARA and I all have this shared experience. Kenny Williams, who's in baseball for 42 years as a player and then as an executive, and Zoraida Samblin, who is a journalist and in media for many, many years. We all had the experience where somebody saw something in us that then they gave us an opportunity. And it was something that wasn't on a piece of paper. It wasn't on a resume or a CV. It came out of them knowing us and experiencing us and knowing what we were capable of. And that's like exactly the opposite of the experience that you get to have when you're in the hiring process, because we just don't have time to kind of have those kind of conversations or to get to know people. And so we often default to hiring people we know or referrals. And there can be some great things that come out of that. It's certainly something we should continue to explore, but it's just so rare that there's the opportunity that we get to see someone in action and sort of see that little spark or that special thing about them that moves them into being able to be have a new opportunity that they wouldn't have. So we collectively started thinking about, why does this so rarely happen? And it really comes down to some of the things you were just talking about, Katie. It comes down to bandwidth. There's this huge increase in applicant volume, but there are higher expectations for teams to move more quickly and to find really outstanding talent. But they're still relying on the same tools, which are basically like resumes or online profiles. And everyone can kind of start to look the same. So unfortunately, that means that you then look for like, well, what are the standout things? What looks maybe a little bit different about this person? And we start leaning into things like logos and companies they've worked for before, where they went to school or what their education is. And everyone who I imagine is on this call with us today, that that can lead to some bias, right? And so it's thinking about bandwidth as a challenge that creates these sorts of things. And then when we think about who is really successful in an organization, it's those intangibles. It's the things that aren't on a resume. It's how does that person communicate with their colleagues? How do they show up in the face of a challenge or get through something? And so we really wanted to be thinking about how we get to those things. How can we get past that? And so while it's really difficult, we do believe that it's really solvable. And so you can see here in front of you, this is how we at CLARA are thinking about these constructs and how we see them play out in the hiring process. And really, there's some fundamental and foundational stuff here. Like somebody needs to have the skills to be able to do the job. And there are certainly roles that it's really important that someone have specific experience or education. There are also a lot of roles where specific experience and education are not necessarily as critical, but they're things that we fall back on. So we really wanted to think about how can we weight those things so that we can help teams take them into account, and when they matter, they really matter. Okay, great, let's focus in on that. But how can we also look at some of those things that are a little harder to measure, like adaptability and the ability to learn and problem solve and deal with those day-to-day challenges and relationships. And so when you look at this construct line here, obviously you see skills, experience, and education, but you're also seeing things like critical thinking, learning agility, and distance traveled. And that's what we want to talk a little bit about today. We want to talk about how those things can be sort of baked into a person's experience and how it works. So you can see here that we launched a new assessment, and we started from scratch. It came out of conversations with quite literally hundreds. I think it was upwards of 300 HR and talent acquisition people that we spoke with. And the reason why is because we really wanted to get at what matters, right? Like, what is it that you're looking for that may or may not be visible on that resume? But when you're thinking about bringing a really amazing candidate to the team, what are you looking for? And so we started thinking about how do we build that, and how do we get at it? And I think one of the things that we found as a great challenge is that sometimes companies are digging into some of these things. They might do a skills assessment, they might do a personality assessment, but the challenge is that it's typically reserved, because they're time consuming and they're expensive. It's typically reserved for those people who are a little bit further down the funnel. Maybe it's the last 3 to 5 candidates, or maybe it is, if it's skill based, maybe they are doing maybe 10 or 12 candidates or something like that. But that means that you have to get through the stages of the process to even get to that spot where someone can see those extra awesome things that you bring to the table. So we wanted to see if we could solve for that. So in doing so, we created a tool that is quick, very simple, very accessible for all kinds of people, whether it is at entry-level positions, whether it's at senior positions, and across all kinds of industries, that would help us understand how critical thinking, learning agility, and what we call distance traveled, which we'll talk a little bit more about how that's defined, how we can measure that and then use that in understanding what a person might bring to the table. So that's kind of an overview of what the assessment was. And I'd really love to kind of lean into letting Dr. King talk a little bit just about, can you talk about the details there around like how many participants and why that matters, that we had 373 people participate, and the age range and those types of things?
Yeah, absolutely. So I can talk a little bit more about the participants, the validation, and then also just the structure of the assessment.
Fantastic. Thank you.
So the assessment, as you can see on the slide here, included 37 different items, which tapped at the 3 constructs that Natasha was talking about: critical thinking, learning agility, and distance traveled. So with critical thinking, we had 15 items that were measuring skills like problem solving, analysis, evaluation, inference. For learning agility, we had 10 items measuring adaptability, cognitive, people, change agility, and then distance traveled, there were 12 items that looked at non-cognitive attributes like grit, resilience, and self-efficacy. And so, also alluded to by Natasha, there was a slightly different development process for these 3 constructs. A little bit later in this presentation, I'll go into critical thinking, learning agility, distance travel, the research behind those. But for critical thinking and learning agility, we were really able to leverage a lot of great prior research and even use some motivation with pre-validated assessments to try to think about the items that could best tap these constructs. So for critical thinking, we relied on validated tools like the Watson-Glaser critical thinking appraisal. For learning agility, we built on foundational research like that conducted by Lombardi and Eichinger, as well as the VIA Edge assessment. For distance travel, this really required more creative input from interdisciplinary literature as well as interdisciplinary researchers So we were able to span psychology, human resources, higher education to really try to get at the heart of what it is when we talk about distance traveled. And for each of these constructs, but especially distance traveled, we were sure to incorporate feedback from professionals in data science, human resources, marketing. And we made sure that the instrument was relevant to the prior research that was conducted, but also could be accessible to participants who were joining in this project to evaluate these items. So we wrote things at the 5th grade reading level to ensure that we had usability of the instrument. So a little bit more about those 373 participants. As you can see here on the screen, their average age was 42 years old, but their ages spanned 20 through 79. The median income for those participants was just slightly above the national average. And we had great gender distribution, with 48% of participants identifying as female and 52% identifying as male. Natasha mentioned, how are we sure that 373 participants is giving us a representative picture? We were able to achieve a margin of error of plus or minus 5%, which helps us feel good about the insights that we're gaining here and feeling good that those might be applicable to the broader US workforce. And just a quick note that we recruited participants through the Positly platform, and they also completed the assessment through that platform. And they underwent a rigorous screening process to make sure that they were paying attention, for example, during the duration of the assessment. So Natasha, hopefully that is helpful. I'm happy to dig into more, or I can pass it back to you to talk a little bit more about those constructs.
No, I think that's great. It lays the foundation for people like me who are not researchers as to why each of these is important. So I really appreciate that. I do think what I'd like to do is, you and I can sort of banter back and forth a little bit. I want to kind of take each of these constructs and talk about how we're defining them, right? So we've got a little definition here on the screen, but what were really the aspects or elements of each one of them and why they were important to what we were doing? And then we can tie that back to the research. I think it'll be important for us to understand why it matters in the workplace. So looking at critical thinking, the sort of core pieces of critical thinking, we looked at around problem solving, open-mindedness, analysis, questioning, evaluating, and inferring. And I think if you're not necessarily a wordsmith or you're not necessarily in research, you look at those and you're like, aren't some of those the same thing? And in some ways they are, right? Because there's overlap. But that's really important because it means that those constructs they're all tied to the same thing. But the reason why we might have multiple aspects that do overlap is because we want to make sure we're getting the entire idea, right? It's sort of like that Swiss cheese notion, where if we have 2 or 3 pieces of cheese layered on top of each other, we've got the whole sandwich covered kind of concept. Again, not the researcher in the group, but you get my point. And I think what's really important here is when we start talking about how these elements in particular roll up to critical thinking, that's great. It's wonderful. We want people to be thinking critically, but why is that important for us in the workplace? Well, it's important because it means that people can take in, process news and information, which means they can make more effective choices that align to the organizational needs and the objectives of the team. It typically often will evidence that there are better foundations for stronger working relationships because people are able to take in information that may or not be familiar to them. And so it means that they can show up in ways where they show a little bit more adaptability, and it also points towards that other construct that we're going to talk about here, learning agility. And so I think that those are the ways that we start to see critical thinking really practically in the workplace. And I would love, Dr. King, if you could talk a little bit about how those things were evidenced in some of the research that we used as sort of foundational and informative to this work.
Absolutely. So as we switch on to the next slide, you can see how these different elements are really reflected in some of the prior work on critical thinking. So with critical thinking, we were able to go back all the way almost 100 years ago to John Dewey in the 1930s. And his work, How We Think, a restatement on the relation of reflective thinking to the educative process, is really the hallmark of critical thinking research and some of the first work that explored what critical thinking is. And so in Dewey's conceptualization, critical thinking entails reflective thinking, curiosity, and open-mindedness. And in his work on this, he found it to be really important in solving problems and making decisions. So critical thinking is almost jargony these days, where someone will say, I want critical thinking. But going back 100 years, this was really a new concept. Like, how does one approach problem solving? How does one approach decision making? And what can they rely on? So according to Dewey, that was really based on reflective thinking, curiosity, and open-mindedness. A few decades later, in the 1960s and then working through the 1980s, Robert Ennis conceptualized critical thinking as, you can see the quote here, a reasonable, reflective thinking process focused on deciding what to believe or do. And so Ennis advocated for explicit teaching of critical thinking, which is really important. So this considers critical thinking as something that can be learned and improved over time. So in all of this work, we're not trying to focus on skills that someone either has or they don't. We're trying to focus on skills and attributes that someone can develop and bring to their employer, their workplace, and really make a contribution as they build on these skills over time. And then the final researcher listed here, Peter Faccioni in the 1990s, was the author of the Delphi Report, which really planted a stake in the ground for what is critical thinking and why is it important. So according to him, there were 6 core skills that were represented in critical thinking, and you can see some of the overlap between this conceptualization and how we are thinking about the various facets of critical thinking. So things like interpretation, analysis, inference, explanation, self-regulation. We use some of these same words in titling our facets of critical thinking because really we are relying on the work that was done prior to us jumping in, really standing on the shoulders of some true academic greats and trying to think about what is critical thinking and why is it important in workplaces. So Natasha, over to you for questions or to consider learning agility.
Yeah, no, I appreciate you giving us a context for that because, and adding that it is something that can be developed because while we want to understand where people sit now, it means that there's room in our organizations to help our team members and folks that we bring into teams develop those skills, which is great for business. I mean, at the end of the day, we want teams that are innovative. We want teams that are, able to solve problems and meet the needs of our customers individually in a more meaningful way, right? Like that impacts bottom line. It means that we get better market share and all of those types of things. And so I know as people, in talent and hiring, we really want to focus on the experience that people have, which is amazing. We can contribute to their development, not only in their work, but in their personal lives, like developing some of these skills. But it also means that as we can be seen as business partners, right? By bringing some of these things and hiring towards some of these things, it means that we can help drive the bottom line in our organization. So I really do think it's important that when we do well for one, it tends to do well for all, right? Like raising, the rising tide raises all ships kind of thing. I think when we're doing better all around. So I love that you made those connections. Thank you for that.
Absolutely.
I think when we start talking about the next construct here, learning agility, some of the ways, if we think about the individual constructs, and this one I think feels very, this one to me feels very like scientific and a little bit formal because it's got all these uses of the words agility. And you're like, well, what does that mean, right? And for me, it's like agility is, can I jump up, do a box jump at the gym, which by the way, I can't. I'm like cemented to the ground. But there are those types of like skills. We think about it physically, but our brains also do that same type of work, right? And it's not only when we think about, can I learn new things, but it's, can I learn new things and apply them in old situations? So am I teachable, right? But it also means, can I take in new information old information and apply it in new situations. So it's like being able to connect those dots, right? And draw inferences and expectations of circumstances or outcomes. And so it's really important right now, especially because the world of work is changing. And we know like AI, right? I mean, it's one of the reasons why we're getting thousands of resumes for an open role is because technology is changing the way we apply. Well, that also means that we have to be responsive on the other side about how we use that technology, right? And having it be a tool. So we need a workforce that can be responsive and adaptable in this particular environment that we're in, we're all navigating for the first time. And so when we think about these elements about not only the way that you think, the cognitive agility, but like change agility, what we're thinking about when we think about results and how we impact others and those relationships, these suddenly become things that you're like, oh, I see how that plays out in the workforce, right? Like I understand why that matters in the world of work. Because if I don't have a growth mindset, if I'm not self-aware enough to be, I don't know, responsive, right? When someone gives me feedback, or to be thinking about how I might change or improve, then we get stuck, right? And we've all seen that. We've all worked with people who are not particularly high in their agility as far as their ability to take in feedback or be responsive. So these are some things that we see. So we might see someone high in learning agility, working on a team where they're really good at finding balance between implementing, for instance, standard protocols, but with new ideas. So again, thinking about how we're starting to incorporate AI into our work, this is a place where we're going to see those folks being able to be really adaptive in having new processes and using new technologies. We're also going to see this is a spot where they start to think about how they might innovate on existing items to make them fit a new set of circumstances. And so maybe it is thinking about the service delivery that you already have. But hey, our team, our customers are now using these new technologies. How can we, as an organization, be responsive and continue to grow and develop and serve them? And then also thinking about taking in those development opportunities. These are going to be some of your folks that when there's an opportunity to learn a new thing and to develop a new skill, you may see them jump on it because they're always thinking about what they can sort of add to their repertoire as far as being able to bring in new information and apply it in old situations. So I'd love for, I mean, all that sounds amazing, but did we make it up or did this come from someplace? So I'd love to see if you could draw some lines for me back to the research where this came from.
Yeah, so you did not make it all up, Natasha. So the good news is that although this is a bit newer than critical thinking, there's some really great research that we were able to draw upon in creating this assessment. So starting in the early 2000s, I mentioned the names Lombardo and Eichinger earlier. Their paper, High Potentials as High Learners, really discusses what you would imagine that it discusses. So high potential employees are indicated by high levels of learning agility. And what is learning agility? Well, according to these seminal researchers on the topic, it was comprised of 5 dimensions, which might look quite similar to what you saw on the previous slide. So mental, people, change, results agility, as well as self-awareness. And you'll notice that we also have the addition of growth mindset, which was highlighted in future research. Demuse, Day, and Hallenbeck, a few years later, took on what is learning agility and why is it important in workplaces. And in both this research, as well as that conducted by DeRue, Ashford, and Myers, which I'll talk on more in a minute, you'll see that this really highlighted the role of learning agility for individuals working in leadership positions. So especially those who are required to notice any change in the environment, take action, lead other people, learning agility was really important there. But we believe, and our research is starting to show, that learning agility is important in all dynamic work contexts, where it's not someone coming into the office doing the same thing day in, day out. If you are expected to adjust to changing conditions, if you are expected to leverage resources, if you are expected to make adjustments to routines or behaviors, learning agility is important for everyone. And so back to Demuse and his colleagues, this construct, learning agility, was distinguished from others by emphasizing its basis in behavioral flexibility and also openness to feedback. So you're not only taking what you've learned in previous situations, you're really perceptive to what's happening in the world around you to be able to adjust accordingly. And then the final research listed on the screen, this work conceptualized learning agility as the ability and willingness to learn from experiences and apply those lessons in new, challenging contexts. And so I'm repeating a lot of the same words here: new, dynamic, volatile, change, challenge. And this really is indicative of so many environments that people are working in today. There are certainly roles that where this is not the case, but as technologies change, as we have the ability to leverage AI in different ways in the workplace, it's becoming increasingly important to have some of these skills that are captured by learning agility. Natasha, anything else there?
Yeah, I mean, every time I listen to you talk about these things that I'm so passionate about, you say something that I'm like, that, we got to talk about that. Because I think when you're talking a little bit about leadership, for instance, and how the work from Demuse, Day, and Hallenbeck really started with looking at like who are going to be those big performers, right? Those A-list sort of rock star unicorns. But the reality is when we think about that that ability, that learning agility, they were looking at it in a particular set of folks who had opportunity, right? What if we knew that people had the ability to be agile learners, or we could help them develop learning agility, which is something that you can do, and we could do that for more of the workforce? Like, wouldn't we then, as a result, be able to create stronger leadership and more opportunity for people in the funnel rather than just those people who sort of maybe naturally land in a spot and then get additional opportunities? So I'm super interested in that because I think it's one place where, as organizational development folks or talent development people, we can start to think about what kind of organizations are we building, and can we use some of these constructs in really meaningful ways to be able to develop that workforce that we're really looking for.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I get all nerdy about this stuff. So this is fantastic.
I love it. I love nerds.
Okay, so let's talk a little bit about distance traveled. And this is going to be one that's going to be more newer. It's going to be less familiar than some of the other constructs because it's really fairly new in the zeitgeist. I think it's maybe been, I don't know, 10, 12-ish years, maybe 15, that people have really been talking about this idea, and that it started to come together and sort of coalesce around what the elements of it are, right? Because we've been talking about grit for years and years and years, but like it never felt like it was its own entire thing. It felt like it was part of a constellation of things. And it has turned out that there's been a lot of work recently, and people may be familiar with Adam Grant. I know you're going to touch on his work, or Angela Duckworth, and they've been talking about these elements of this work for a long time. But I think what's interesting is that we've measured those things independently of work. And we've sort of looked at them, and oftentimes we looked at some of these things like grit and resilience and resourcefulness. We kind of look at those like maybe related to sports or physical performance. Maybe when we talk about resourcefulness, that may be one that sort of we looked at in the work world, but oftentimes we looked at it like as an individual personal trait of someone that we knew. We didn't really think about how these things might play out in the workforce. Proactivity, I think we saw a little bit more in work, right? Because none of us want to babysit anybody else, and none of us want to be babysat. And so that proactivity was something I think people have been paying attention to a lot. But that really, that self-efficacy and anti-fragility, they're all kind of these concepts that are just beginning to coalesce in the last few years. And so to put them under this umbrella where we recognize that they're important in day-to-day work and in day-to-day relationships, that they bring added value that a person to a team or to an organization. I think one, that's important. And I think two, to be able to define and articulate what does distance traveled mean as a whole, and then why is it important for us to measure and work? I think that's been really interesting to me. So one of the things I would say before we kind of look at the research is, there's this delta. We're all born with a certain amount of potential, and then we engage in opportunities. We have experiences that increase our the likelihood that we'll be able to reach that potential. But for every one of us, there's this delta between sort of actual potential and realized potential. And I think one of the places where we see this impact folks the most is when they haven't had the same access to education or resources or opportunity, or maybe they've had access, but they haven't had guidance or support in learning how to leverage that access, right? Like, it's great for someone to say, oh, this is an amazing opportunity for you to go to Greece, but if you don't speak Greek, you don't have any dollars, you don't know your way around, and you don't know anyone, that is not a great opportunity. That seems terrifying, right? So it's very similar. And so I think trying to close that or identify what that delta is, and then how can we hire toward that potential and put people in great scenarios, is really something that I get really excited about. And so this obviously impacts, I think, groups who are typically underrepresented, sort of underestimated or overlooked for whatever reason, whether that be because of a disability, whether that be because of race or ethnicity, their religion, whatever. This does tend to impact most those groups who are sort of marginalized in some way, shape, or form. Obviously, I'm very passionate about this, so I'll step away from my little box and the microphone, and I want to hand it to you to maybe point to some of the research that's
Yeah, so I'll jump on the box with you and grab the microphone. I think talking about distance traveled what brought Natasha and I together. We were both really jazzed about this idea and trading information, and was really excited to engage in this project. And it really was fun for this construct. What an opportunity to try to really establish something and try to condense all of the information that exists out there and try to come up with a new conceptualization of what is distance traveled. And so, as I mentioned previously, as Natasha alluded to, there was less out there in the world about distance traveled as a distinct construct. But looking back as far as, I think Booker T. Washington was one of the first resources that I leveraged in thinking about this. And there's a quote that I don't have written down, but it's something related to the measure of a person is not where they are, but how far they came to get there. So this idea of distance traveled as being really important is not new. It's just the formalized conceptualization and measurement of it that's new. And so what we have on the screen here is just, a few examples of some of the academic insights that we leveraged in conceptualizing distance traveled. So Natasha mentioned Angela Duckworth. Along with her colleagues, Peterson, Matthew, and Kelly, the paper Grit was published in 2007 that later had a book based upon it and a number of other resources. But really, Grit here was defined as perseverance and passion for long-term goals, emphasizing overcoming obstacles. Again, suggesting that persistence predicts success in these dynamic environments. So you can see the idea of overcoming challenges that get in your way gives you something that you can hopefully apply in the future. And so I'll talk a little bit more in a minute about the distinction between these constructs, but also that they're related. So thinking about the Swiss cheese metaphor, hopefully when we're having all of these different aspects of distance travel, they're really closely related to each other. They're also going to be slightly related to things like learning agility. So you mentioned this is important in dynamic environments. That's because distance traveled and learning agility, often someone who excels in one is more likely to do well in the other, but they are distinct enough that it's important to measure them separately. So Ray and Brown, so this goes back about 10 years ago. This is really one of the first papers to look at distance traveled as a predictor of something important. And here, Ray and Brown looked at the importance of distance traveled along with grit and hardiness in medical school success. So it's not just in workplaces where these things are important. Distance traveled has really been looked at as a key predictor of academic success in undergraduate work, medical school, as well as graduate work in other areas. So traditional criteria often overlook these non-cognitive attributes that provide important insight about potential. And so the title for today's webinar, the title that I'll mention in a second when I talk about Adam Grant, is all about this hidden potential. What is it in a candidate's background that leads them to be able to take on challenges and be more likely to succeed? We think distance traveled is a really important part of that. So then Adam Grant, Natasha mentioned, I mentioned the book Hidden Potential. Another excellent book looks at thinking again, which is an important construct, but really here, this hidden potential values that potential that exists within someone above their static talent. So what's more important is not your ability to do a task right now, but your ability to learn how to do that task and to perform in the future, especially in changing environments. So hidden potential does explicitly mention distance traveled as a construct, but in conjunction with these other facets like grit, resilience, and adaptability that we believe collectively comprise the potential that one has to contribute in an organization, in a school, or in another setting. And so I briefly mentioned that these three constructs, critical thinking, learning agility, distance traveled, they're all related. And that's why it's important to look at them together rather than alone, but also to look at them individually because there are some important distinctions that are hopefully clear, but I know we'll talk a little bit more about what makes these each unique in this webinar and then in future webinars in this series. So Natasha, back to you.
Yeah, I love how you've laid that out, Kylie. Thank you. Because I think that we often there's this, we're torn, if I may. We're torn a little bit. I'm like, what do I need to know about a person to know how they can perform? Like, what's it okay to talk about and ask, right? And have that kind of conversation. We want to give people privacy and the right to share their story if they're interested. And it's also really helpful to have an environment where someone can share maybe something they've learned. They don't necessarily need to talk about the circumstances or how they landed there, but to know what they've learned from those experiences is really important. And the reason why is because we see that start to play out in work settings. Like, are they, when we think about grit, are they able to focus on taking action to ensure long-term success? Are they thinking about how to work as a team when there are limited resources, right? Are they able to really keep a healthy, balanced confidence with their confidence in themselves to be able to like do a thing and feel like they're going to be able to achieve it, even if it's hard or it's outside or maybe on their growth edge? Are they going to be thinking about problems before they happen? Are they proactive, or are they just kind of like wander through the world, like waiting for things to come their way? And I think that resilience and that responsiveness is also really important, because can they take that negative feedback and turn it into an opportunity to grow, right? And so I think all of those individual elements of distance traveled that we saw on that last slide really matter. And they matter because when we start thinking about how we hire and how we build teams, it helps us be more efficient in building those teams and in working toward creating dynamic organizations. It helps us build equity into our processes. And it really helps us get better hiring outcomes. But to really focus on the construct itself around distance traveled is to think about how people show up, what they bring, and how we can then start to put together teams that leverage all of that, right? Like, and that's not a new concept. I mean, hiring folks have been doing this for years, right? They think about the team that they have, they get a slate of amazing candidates, and they pick the person who balances best or contributes best to the group that exists. But if we're not looking at some of those other traits and characteristics, we can easily get lost and start to hire more of the same rather than thinking about balancing and creating more dynamic teams.
Yeah, and I'll just mention one more thing related to distance traveled. So you talked about it's not about asking candidates to divulge like what tragic experiences have you persevered through, right? But there are ways where we can get at distance traveled without asking for specific examples. So the items that we wrote were meant to capture one's ability to have that frame of mind, to demonstrate the grit, to demonstrate being able to persevere and persist without asking about specific experiences. So again, this is what makes this work so exciting and so much fun.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I have like 8,000 more questions and ways I want to dig into this. So I'm excited that we're going to be doing that here in the coming year to dig into this. But again, so just thinking about how this relates to organizations and hiring teams and why they should care in the moment. It's creating that efficiency for your team. We know that teams are just expected to do so much with so little right now. And even if they do have resources, even if they're in a well-resourced organization, AI and the number of resumes coming in are just making it difficult to like be super to pay attention and to give everyone exactly the same treatment. And so creating that equity and better outcomes that help it HR and talent acquisition people be seen as the business partners that they really are, driving those outcomes, I think is really meaningful and important. So if we could start then to think about, we take these concepts, how do then companies use these constructs? I think we just want to be a little bit specific about, and we can go to the next slide here, in thinking about how they can be identifying this talent very early in the process, right? So we talked at the top of this around the fact that a lot of times assessments don't come into the process until after the fact, right? They come in when we've got 5 candidates or 10 candidates who are sort of at the end, and we want to be able to give them and find some differentiation between them. But if we can do that sooner, it means that we can surface some of the needles in the haystack that we may overlook, right? That are getting filtered out by keyword search or Boolean searches or whatever the case may be. We're able to find some of that value add potential and kind of get more out of the ATSs that we're using or the other tools. And I think it's important because not only does it mean that we're looking at qualitative data, but by creating this assessment, we've created a way that we can actually have quantitative data on someone's abilities to add these valuable traits and characteristics and abilities to a team. And I think that's really important because it's not just a gut choice, right? We're not just saying, hey, this person feels like, man, they could get anything done. It's like we can actually look at it and point to and say, this person is that type of talent that we're looking for. And so we can grow them in this organization and find a space where their talents can really thrive and shine. And I think that's really important. Anything you would add to that? Like, I think the research shows that, but you tell me.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. I think that those are all important things to know. And really, as you mentioned, considering the way that when we consider the people we bring into the organization, that's maybe one of the most important ways that an organization can prepare itself for the future and to really have an awareness of this and a partnering between hiring professionals, human resources professionals, and organizational scientists more broadly. I think it's really critical and will be more so moving forward.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, there are a couple questions I'd like to ask you about some of the things we found out in the research. And one of them would be, are there differences between people with different backgrounds, whether it's age or education, in how they responded to these questions and what their scores might have been?
Yeah, so excellent question. In terms of age, one interesting finding based on our pilot study, we found that older individuals had higher levels of learning agility than those who were younger, and it didn't really fall off at a certain point. And so this is supported by some prior work that shows as you accumulate those life experiences, obviously you have more to pull from when you're applying past lessons to future challenges. Another interesting finding was that people who were currently enrolled in a university, a college or university setting, had higher levels of critical thinking than those who were not. And again, this is somewhat expected, right? That critical thinking is probably something that they're doing a little bit more regularly. The differences weren't very extreme, though. So they were practically significant in my mind, but not statistically significant. And so it really shows that critical thinking is something that while you're in school actively doing this, it's important. It's something that you still can continue to keep on doing later on.
I remember one of the things that we talked about in thinking about learning agility and how one gains that through experience. We have not yet done this part of the study, but we did sort of extrapolate the idea, and I'd love to hear you if you're willing to step outside of the actual research for just a moment. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the idea that when we think about people, for instance, returning to the workplace after an absence, whether they left to be a caretaker or for whatever reason they were out of the workforce, maybe it might have been incarceration, it might have been went back to school, it might have been I switched careers for a minute. There's something happening in that time when they're gone where they're not stagnant. They're still learning. They're still adding to their experiences. And in fact, the example that we were talking about was, a person who's left to take care of maybe a child for the first time or an elderly parent for the first time. It's a completely new set of circumstances to them if they've never done it before. So they're really actually at their growth edge, gaining all these new skills that then if they have that learning agility, they can bring back with them into a new environment or into an old environment and really start to draw some dots. Are you willing to get off the research train for just a second and take some guesses on that with me?
Yeah, well, I can hop onto someone else's research train and say, yes, absolutely. So being able to have experiences in other contexts, like oftentimes people are able to leverage those and make an impact in a different type of setting. And so it's being able to think differently about what was learned in one setting, apply that to another. Absolutely, prior research has shown that. And I'm hoping that some of our work can show that in the future. One recent gripe that I have is I saw an organization that looked at salaries, and their basis for salary raises was time in position and then time within one organization. And really, that is the antithesis of what we're talking about here, right? So it's so important that as we think about identifying and rewarding those high value, high potential contributors, so often you are able to do more when you have diverse experiences. And I think organizations are starting to catch up with that. Research is starting to show that. And I think there's a lot of potential for future opportunity in organizations in that area.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really great point. Like even when we think about, we send people on sabbatical, right, to learn something and to come back. Like this is a working sabbatical, right? Like I am off learning a new thing and I'm coming back to the workforce. So there's so much there to learn. And I know that we're at time here. Is there anything that you would add before we wrap around your thoughts about how this impacts workforce or reducing bias or anything like that before we end?
Yeah, I'll just make one more comment that I think we've been hearing a lot, or maybe it's just the nerdy circles that I run in, but I've been hearing a lot of backlash against the idea of meritocracy, right? That in striving for meritocracy, we oftentimes promote things that we are not intending to, right? So that children of parents who have higher levels of education are more likely to in turn have higher levels of education and then do in turn after that be better prepared for careers or seem to be, right? Because they have that degree from the institution. I think when we look at these non-cognitive skills, these things like critical thinking, learning agility, especially distance traveled, these are a new kind of meritocracy. We can't get in my mind, I am a fan of rewarding high performers and rewarding people with high potential and providing them with opportunities to really to leverage their potential and leverage their learnings. And so I think that we can reframe meritocracy to look at merit in terms of something like distance traveled is a really great way to think about how we can do this moving forward. And so I'm so excited to continue working with you, Natasha, and your team and others to try to think about how we can leverage some of this work to contribute to this conversation more broadly. So I love it.
Yeah, that's a really interesting idea. So now I have 14 more ideas for research. So I'm looking forward to the next year expanding upon this, but also sharing this. I'm hoping that people can embrace it in such a way that I think there's so many ideas here. They're not necessarily new. They've just not been articulated often enough that TA and HR folks still find themselves having to make the argument for some of these things. And I'm hoping that this research can contribute to them being able to do that in a really meaningful way, while they can then embed equity in their process and like just do it, right? Without having to like force people into understanding why it's super important. So I'm really excited about this. Thank you so much for your work. And Katie, I'll hand the talking stick back to you.
Yeah, thank you both so much. I feel like I've just audited a university course, which is fantastic. So thank you for that. We do have a lot of content around this research, and one of the most fun pieces, I think, is our ebook, which will go into some of these topics further. You can actually get that ebook by scanning the QR code here. So we made that easy for you. But we do have many other resources available on our website and our resources section. So feel free to check those out as well.
Awesome.
And we have many more sessions left to go. We have 3 more sessions left in the Hidden Potential series. So we will be doing a deep dive into each of the different constructs. We have folks who are HRTA practitioners who will be joining Natasha to look deeper into these things. And so we're really excited about those conversations. You can follow us on LinkedIn. We'll be posting those events there. And we'll also be providing them on demand on our website after the live session. So we hope that you will join us.
All right. Thank you both very much. Wishing you
Thank
all
you.
an amazing day.
Thank you, everyone.